Audrey Wexford Carrington had grown used to watching other people lower their eyes first. But, on that particular morning, the man she dismissed as some misplaced delivery worker quietly pressed a folded scrap of paper into her palm. Rowan Pierce did not beg, did not explain himself, and did not wait for permission to speak. He only murmured that she should follow every line exactly, or she would lose everything before sundown. Audrey almost let the paper fall into the nearest waste bin without a second thought. Then the first line came true. Then the second line turned an entire boardroom pale, and by the time the final line unfolded, it had already saved the Wexford empire from someone sitting close enough to touch her hand. If cold reversals and quiet reckonings are the kind of stories that keep you watching until the very end, tap subscribe now, because this is the tale of a single note that brought down an empire from the inside. The 88th floor of the Wexford Dominion Tower rose above Manhattan like a private kingdom built from glass and certainty, and on that morning it hummed with a stillness that only enormous money could purchase. Audrey was preparing to sign a merger worth $11.4 billion with Kingsley Crown Capital, a deal that would determine whether her family's empire expanded into the next decade or slowly dissolved under its own debts. The conference room had been built for exactly this kind of moment, with bulletproof windows overlooking the city, a table carved from a single slab of dark walnut, financial displays glowing along every wall, and lawyers, shareholders, and reporters gathered just beyond the doors like an audience waiting for a coronation. Audrey walked into that room the way she walked into every room, with the unshaken posture of someone born to give instructions rather than receive them. She had inherited that posture the way other people inherit height or the color of their eyes, absorbed so early in childhood that she no longer remembered learning it at all. Her father had built Wexford Dominion out of shipping contracts and stubbornness decades earlier, and by the time Audrey was old enough to understand what the family name meant, she had already learned that hesitation was a weakness reserved for people who worked beneath her. She had spent years proving herself sharper than every executive who assumed a young woman inheriting an empire could be pushed aside, and that constant proving had hardened into something closer to armor than confidence. Today was meant to be the culmination of all of it, the deal that would silence anyone who still whispered that she had only ever been handed her position rather than earning it. Assistants moved through the outer hallway carrying tablets and folders, adjusting the temperature, testing the microphones, rehearsing the choreography of a signing meant to be broadcast in fragments across financial networks by evening. None of them noticed the quiet exhaustion in Audrey's eyes as she paused for half a second before the door, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying a company on her shoulders while pretending the weight did not exist. She smoothed the front of her blazer, exhaled once, and stepped inside as though she had never doubted anything in her life. Rowan arrived a few minutes later in a plain technician's uniform, carrying a worn tool bag, summoned only because the projection system had failed minutes before the signing was set to begin. Leland Price, the chief financial officer, wrinkled his nose at the sight of him and quietly told security to keep the basement staff away from the contract table. Audrey glanced at Rowan the way she might glance at a chair that had been placed slightly out of alignment, an object to be tolerated rather than acknowledged. She told him to fix the equipment and leave, because today belonged to people who actually mattered. Rowan said nothing in return. He knelt beside the tangled cables and began his work, but his eyes moved carefully across the room, resting for a moment on Leland, then on Grant Ashbury, then on Bramwell Wexford, then finally on Harlan Kingsley himself, and something in his extermination suggested he had already noticed what nobody else in that gleaming room had bothered to see. Nobody in that room had any idea how quietly and how thoroughly Rowan had already studied them, arriving early enough to walk past 3 separate offices under the excuse of checking connection cables, long enough to notice which men lowered their voices whenever certain names surfaced. He had learned to read power the way other people read weather, watching for pressure changes long before the storm ever announced itself. To the executives seated around that table, he was simply a uniform and a tool bag, easily forgotten the moment his task appeared finished. That, he had learned years earlier, was precisely the kind of invisibility a person could use to see everything worth seeing. Before he left, Rowan passed close to Audrey, and in the half-second when no one else was watching, he slipped a small folded note into her hand. He told her, in a voice barely above breath, not to sign anything before 17 minutes past 3, and not to trust the man standing to her left. Audrey frowned, certain she had just been approached by someone unstable, perhaps even dangerous. But Rowan had already disappeared through the closing elevator doors before she could summon security. She looked down at the paper in her palm, unfolded it, and read the first line written in plain, unhurried handwriting. "When Leland offers to trade pens, refuse him." Audrey read the note twice, and both times her irritation deepened rather than her curiosity. To her mind, Rowan was nothing more than a struggling contract worker, a man with no standing to insert himself into a deal worth billions of dollars. She nearly crushed the paper into a ball, but before she could, Leland Price approached holding a slim silver pen between 2 fingers. He smiled the practiced smile of a man who had learned exactly how much warmth to offer a superior, and suggested she use this particular pen instead of her own, since it had belonged to her father and seemed more fitting for a historic signature. Audrey went still for a moment longer than she intended, because the words matched the note in her hand almost exactly. She kept her composure on the surface, though something colder had begun moving beneath it. She declined the pen and reached for her own instead, and for a flicker of a second Leland's expression slipped before he smoothed it back into place. The second line on the note instructed her that when Grant claimed a certain clause was merely procedural, she should insist on reading Article 19 in full. Minutes later, Grant Ashbury said almost that exact phrase while gesturing toward a section of the contract, and Audrey felt a chill settle along the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She stopped the signing procedure entirely and demanded that Article 19 be read aloud before the full board. Grant tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, insisting the clause only concerned standard shareholder protections and hardly warranted the delay. Audrey pressed harder, forcing him to display the complete text on the main screen, and the language proved dense and deliberately technical, the kind of writing designed to be skimmed rather than understood. But the note in her hand carried one more instruction she had not yet used. Do not read the version on the screen. Read the version printed from machine number 3. Audrey turned to her assistant and ordered a fresh printout from that specific machine in the side office, and both Leland and Grant reacted with a stillness that lasted only an instant, yet it was enough for Audrey to register the fear hiding behind their composure. The printed version did not match the version displayed moments earlier. Buried within Article 19 was a sentence that had been quietly omitted from the digital display, a clause stating that if Wexford Dominion was ever flagged for what it called a governance risk following the signing, Kingsley Crown Capital would gain the authority to activate an emergency control provision, one that would strip Audrey of her voting power entirely. The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the ventilation system seemed suddenly loud. Several shareholders exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to blame a printing error or something far worse, while the reporters gathered outside the glass remained oblivious to the quiet unraveling taking place only feet away from them. Audrey felt something shift inside her chest, not quite fear yet, but the early edge of it, the recognition that the ground she had always assumed was solid, might be resting on something far less stable. She kept her expression composed out of habit alone, though her mind was already racing through every meeting, every signature, every reassurance Leland had offered her over the past several months. Audrey looked down again at the folded paper, where the next line waited in the same unhurried handwriting. "This is not everything." Audrey ordered security to locate Rowan and bring him back to the room, only to be told he had already left the building entirely. His personnel file, when pulled up on a tablet, offered almost nothing beyond a technician contract, modest pay, an unremarkable record, and a note that he lived in Queens with a young daughter. Leland attempted to steer the momentum back toward the signing, suggesting the printed discrepancy was likely a clerical error or an outdated system glitch. Harlan Kingsley, the billionaire behind the merger, adopted a tone of generous patience, remarking that Audrey should not allow an anonymous scrap of paper to derail the future of her own company. Audrey remained proud, but she was far from foolish, and she requested a 30-minute pause before continuing, ostensibly to review the discrepancy with her legal team. During that pause, she read further down the note, where the next line asked her to question why account number 7714 still carried her mother's name. Bramwell Wexford, her father's brother, sat to her immediate right, the same man who had steadied the company through crisis after her father's decline, the relative she had trusted longer than almost anyone else alive. She asked him directly, in front of the entire board, what that account number represented. Audrey remembered, briefly and without wanting to, the summers she had spent as a child trailing after Bram through the company's old regional offices, watching him charm executives twice his age with an ease her own father had never quite possessed. He had taught her how to shake hands firmly, how to read a balance sheet before she turned 12, how to smile at people she distrusted without ever letting them see it. She had believed, for most of her life, that those lessons came from love. Sitting across from him now, she wondered for the first time whether they had simply been training for a moment exactly like this one, preparing her to trust him long after trust had stopped being earned. Bram hesitated for only a heartbeat before denying any knowledge of it, quickly pivoting to suggest that Audrey was being manipulated by an outsider with an unclear agenda. Audrey overrode him and instructed the finance department to trace the account immediately. The results arrived within minutes, revealing that the account belonged to a trust established decades earlier by her late mother, Eleanor Wexford Carrington, a trust that had once held a valuable portfolio of energy patents and autonomous flight infrastructure. Over many years, those assets had been quietly siphoned away in small transfers, each one authorized by a signature belonging to Bramwell Wexford. Audrey stared at the uncle she had trusted since childhood, and for the first time she saw something crack behind his carefully maintained calm. Bram argued that she did not understand the sacrifices required to keep Wexford Dominion afloat during difficult years, his voice rising with a defensiveness that told her more than his words ever could. The note in her hand offered one final instruction for this moment, warning that if Bram referred to her as his brother's daughter, she should check the hallway security footage from 9:06 that same morning. Moments later, Bram used that precise phrase, and Audrey understood with total certainty that Rowan had not been guessing at anything from the very beginning. Audrey left the boardroom herself and descended to the technical level of the building, an area she had never once bothered to visit in all her years running the company. The elevator took considerably longer to reach that floor than any she had ridden before, passing levels she recognized only by number rather than function, and she found herself oddly aware of how unfamiliar her own company had become the moment she stepped outside the executive corridors. The corridor below was narrow and lit with flat white light, the steady hum of servers filling the air, and technicians moved through their tasks without glancing up, as if long accustomed to being invisible to anyone arriving from the floors above. A few of them noticed her eventually, straightening slightly out of old habit before returning to their monitors, uncertain whether her presence signaled trouble or simply curiosity. Audrey walked past rows of humming equipment she could not begin to name, aware for the first time of how much of her own company's infrastructure existed entirely outside her understanding. She found Rowan in an old maintenance office at the end of the corridor, packing his bag because his contract had already been terminated the moment Leland learned about the note. He worked in silence, unhurried, as though being dismissed from a tower he barely belonged to in the first place carried no particular sting. Audrey still spoke in the commanding tone she used with everyone, demanding to know who he really was and how he possessed information no outsider could reasonably have. Rowan answered without raising his voice, telling her that he was the kind of person she never bothered to look at, which was exactly why he heard things she never had the chance to hear. Audrey accused him of surveillance, of manipulation, but Rowan simply handed her a faded employee badge from 9 years earlier. It read Rowan Pierce, Emergency Systems Architect, Wexford Dominion Recovery Division, a department she vaguely remembered being dissolved after a data center fire long before she assumed full control of the company. Rowan explained that he had once built the emergency recovery infrastructure for Wexford Dominion himself, a system capable of preserving every contract revision, every digital signature, every hidden account, and every internal access change permanently. He had been proud of that work once, proud enough to believe that a company as large as Wexford Dominion deserved a safeguard nobody could quietly erase, a permanent record that would outlast any single executive's ambition. He had spent nearly 2 years building it, testing it, hardening it against every kind of interference he could imagine, never once suspecting that the greatest threat to his work would come from inside the very walls he was trying to protect. Before he could finish delivering that system, his wife, Mallory Pierce, a data auditor working within the company, discovered that someone was using the corporation's own infrastructure to quietly drain the Wexford family's private assets. She had noticed it first as a small irregularity buried inside a quarterly reconciliation report, a transfer that did not match any authorized project, the kind of detail most auditors would have dismissed as a clerical mistake. Mallory had never been the kind of person who dismissed anything. She pulled the thread further, quietly, carefully, documenting every discrepancy she found in a private file she kept separate from the company's own servers, certain that whoever was responsible held enough influence to bury the truth if she raised the alarm too loudly too soon. Mallory tried repeatedly to warn Audrey directly, drafting messages that never reached anyone above a certain level of the company, routed instead through layers of assistants and gatekeepers who saw only the words of a mid-level auditor and decided the matter could wait. She grew more insistent as the weeks passed, requesting meetings that were quietly rescheduled again and again, until she finally decided to build a fail-safe of her own, rather than continue waiting for permission to be heard. Weeks later, Mallory died in what officials ruled a routine accident involving a slick road surface, a conclusion Rowan had never fully accepted even after years of trying to make peace with it. Without enough hard evidence to accuse anyone by name, and with a young daughter suddenly depending on him alone, Rowan withdrew entirely from the technology world, taking quiet, low-paying jobs while continuing his investigation from the shadows, waiting for the one moment when the truth might finally have somewhere safe to land. Audrey said nothing for a long moment, absorbing the realization that the man she had dismissed within seconds that morning had lost far more than she had ever imagined losing herself. She thought back to the tone she had used with him, the careless words about people who actually mattered, and felt an unfamiliar heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with anger directed outward. It occurred to her that she had spent years walking past dozens of people, exactly like Rowan, technicians and assistants, and drivers whose names she never bothered to learn, never once wondering what histories or losses they carried beneath their uniforms. Rowan looked at her steadily and told her that the note had never been meant to save her. It had only been meant to give her the chance to save herself. Audrey asked Rowan what the final line on the note actually meant, since it had told her that at 17 minutes past 3, she needed to shut off every screen in the room and demand that the contract be signed on blank paper instead. She could not immediately understand the logic, since turning off the displays would throw the meeting into chaos, and demanding paper signatures would make her look unstable in front of the entire board. Rowan explained that the digital version of the contract had been layered with a false display, meaning that whatever text appeared on those screens was never the complete or accurate document. Every screen in that boardroom ran through servers controlled by Leland, and if Audrey signed electronically, her signature would be automatically attached to a second hidden package of documents. That hidden package contained a resignation order, a full transfer of operational control, and formal recognition of Kingsley Crown Capital as an emergency governing authority over the company. Audrey asked why the timing mattered so specifically, and Rowan told her that the moment corresponded to when an old backup system quietly reactivated itself, a system Mallory had installed years earlier before her death. That system operated for only a handful of minutes each year, precisely on the date Wexford Dominion filed its annual report, functioning as a kind of time-locked vault Mallory had built in case something ever happened to her. Audrey now faced an impossible decision, forced to choose between trusting a stranger she had met only hours earlier or trusting the board that had stood beside her for years. She returned to the boardroom, where Leland and Harlan pressed her to sign immediately, reminding her that reporters were already gathered outside and that the markets were reacting nervously to every delay. If she continued stalling, she risked being blamed publicly for sabotaging the very deal meant to secure her company's future. At 16 minutes past 3, Audrey finally lifted her pen, and Leland allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, while Bram exhaled with visible relief, and Grant quietly signaled to his legal team that everything was proceeding as planned. Then, exactly at 17 minutes past 3, Audrey set the pen down without touching the paper and calmly ordered every screen in the room switched off. The room froze in stunned silence. When the screens went dark, an emergency backup power source clicked on, and an old projector in the corner of the room, one nobody had used in years, flickered to life on its own, displaying an interface almost everyone had forgotten existed, labeled the Wexford Recovery Archive. The name of its original architect appeared on-screen first, Rowan Pierce. Beneath it appeared the name of the person who had sealed the final layer of evidence within it, Mallory Pierce. Leland immediately demanded that security remove Rowan from the premises, accusing him of illegal data intrusion, manipulation of the chief executive, and endangering a deal of national financial significance. Grant Ashbury echoed the accusation, suggesting to the room that Audrey was being led astray by a bitter former employee with a personal grudge. For a moment Audrey appeared to waver, and the conspirators allowed themselves to believe she might be losing her footing entirely. She asked Rowan, in front of everyone, whether he actually possessed any legally admissible proof. Rowan answered simply that he did, but that he was not the one who could unlock it. He turned his gaze toward Audrey as he said it. The Recovery Archive required 2 forms of verification to open, one belonging to a member of the Wexford bloodline, and one belonging to the system's original architect. Rowan held the second key. Audrey alone held the first. Bram tried desperately to stop her, warning that opening the archive risked exposing secrets that could permanently damage her parents' reputation, a calculated appeal to the one fear he knew ran deepest in her, the fear that her family's polished legacy might not survive close inspection. Audrey hesitated since she had been raised from childhood to view the Wexford name as a symbol of unassailable honor. But that same morning, nearly everyone she considered family had already lied to her face, at least once. She placed her hand against the verification scanner while Rowan entered his architect credentials beside her. The archive opened. The screens filled with a sequence of recordings, audio files, hidden contracts, and transfer histories, including footage of Leland, Bram, Grant, and a representative from Kingsley Crown Capital meeting in secret months earlier. In one recording, Leland could be heard laughing about how easily Audrey trusted the people closest to her, remarking that a woman raised to believe in family loyalty made an unusually simple target. In another, Grant walked a Kingsley representative through the exact language he intended to bury inside Article 19, explaining precisely how to phrase the emergency control clause so that no outside counsel reviewing it quickly would notice the danger hidden within it. Their plan extended far beyond simply gaining control of Wexford Dominion. They intended to funnel every bad debt, every illegal loan, and every criminal liability directly onto Audrey's shoulders once the transfer was complete, positioning her as the reckless heir whose mismanagement had finally caught up with the family legacy. The archive also contained transfer records stretching back years, each withdrawal from Eleanor's trust timed carefully around board meetings and audits, small enough individually to avoid suspicion, but staggering once assembled into a single continuous ledger. Harlan Kingsley rose from his seat with unsettling calm, suggesting that everything could still be negotiated, offering Audrey a dignified exit from her own company in exchange for his continued protection of the family name. Audrey glanced down at the smallest line on Rowan's note, nearly hidden in the crease of the paper, which read that when they finally offered her dignity, it meant they had run out of options. For the first time that entire day, Audrey allowed herself to smile. Audrey had believed the financial evidence represented the largest revelation of the day, but Rowan told her one final section of the archive remained locked. A folder Mallory had labeled simply Eleanor, the name of Audrey's late mother. Audrey's anger flared at the idea of dragging her mother into the unfolding scandal, and Rowan gently told her she was under no obligation to open it if she was not ready. He added only that Mallory had lost her life, partly in an effort to protect whatever truth that folder contained. Audrey opened it anyway. Inside was an old audio recording of a conversation between Eleanor Wexford, Carrington, and Bramwell Wexford, in which Eleanor confronted him directly about secretly collaborating with the Kingsley Fund to strip away core assets from Wexford Dominion piece by piece. Eleanor had planned to revise her will, transferring oversight of the entire company to Audrey the moment she came of age, precisely to prevent this kind of betrayal. But Eleanor passed away before she could finalize the change. The revelation cut deeper than any financial fraud could. Audrey's mother had never trusted Bram the way he had spent years claiming she did. Quietly, Eleanor had inserted a protective clause of her own, stating that if evidence ever surfaced proving the board had conspired to illegally transfer company assets, temporary control of the entire corporation would automatically revert to the sole direct heir, Audrey herself. It meant that Audrey was never actually at risk of losing her empire that day. If she chose to expose the evidence publicly, she held the power to remove the entire conspiracy in a single stroke. Bram's composure shattered completely, and he shouted that Eleanor had been naive, that Wexford Dominion would have collapsed years ago without his interventions. It was the moment every carefully constructed mask in that family finally slipped away for good. Audrey was no longer the proud, dismissive executive who had walked into the room that morning. She felt pain, real and unguarded, but she also felt clarity, understanding at last that Rowan's note had never simply been about saving a company. It had forced her to confront a truth her entire life had conspired to hide from her. She turned to Rowan and asked why he had never used any of this evidence to blackmail her instead. Rowan answered quietly that his wife had not died so that he could become exactly the kind of person who had destroyed her. Harlan Kingsley made one final attempt to regain control of the room, declaring that any evidence pulled from an outdated internal archive held no legal standing, since Rowan had been terminated and clearly carried a personal motive for revenge. Grant Ashbury added that releasing unverified documents publicly could send Wexford Dominion stock into freefall, potentially costing thousands of employees their jobs. It was a calculated strike designed to reframe the truth itself as the greater danger to the company's survival. Audrey remained silent for several long seconds before ordering the boardroom doors opened to admit the independent auditors, financial regulators, and journalists already waiting outside. Leland's face drained of color as he warned her that such a move amounted to corporate suicide. Audrey answered him evenly, telling him that true suicide would be signing a contract written entirely by her enemies. In front of the assembled press, Audrey did not attempt to soften or bury the scandal unfolding around her. Flashbulbs lit the room in irregular bursts as she spoke, her voice steadier than she felt, each sentence chosen with the same care she once reserved only for negotiating contracts. She revealed the falsified contract clause, the drained trust account, the conspiracy to seize control of the company, and the full extent of Kingsley Crown Capital's involvement, laying out the timeline plainly enough that even reporters unfamiliar with corporate law could follow the shape of the betrayal. She also acknowledged publicly that Wexford Dominion had failed to protect Mallory Pierce, the employee who had once tried desperately to warn the company about exactly this kind of betrayal. A murmur moved through the gathered journalists at the mention of a name none of them recognized, and Audrey did not rush past it the way a more careful executive might have. She explained, briefly and without theatrics, that a woman inside this very building had tried to raise an alarm years earlier and had been silenced by nothing more sinister than indifference, and that such indifference would no longer be tolerated inside any department of the company she led. Rowan did not step forward into the spotlight. He remained at the back of the room exactly where he had stood earlier that morning, though this time he was no longer invisible to anyone present. Camera lenses caught the brief moment Audrey turned to look at him just before making the most consequential decision of her career. She activated the protective clause her mother had written years before, instantly freezing the voting power held by Bram, Leland, and every board member connected to the conspiracy. Grant was suspended from his legal position on the spot, and the merger with Kingsley Crown Capital was terminated before a single additional signature could be collected. Harlan Kingsley, who had arrived that morning expecting to absorb the entire Wexford empire, now found himself walking out through a corridor lined with reporters and camera flashes, his usual composure fraying slightly with each question shouted from behind the barricades. Bram was escorted out through a separate exit reserved for situations the company preferred the cameras not to see, his protests growing quieter with each step, until he disappeared entirely from the version of the story the public would remember. Grant Ashbury said almost nothing at all, resigned in the particular way of a man who understood that no clever legal argument could rescue him this time, while Leland kept insisting, to anyone still willing to listen, that everything had simply been a misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion. Before the moment fully closed, Rowan handed Audrey one more item, not the original note this time, but a sealed letter Mallory had left behind years earlier. Inside, a single line read that if Audrey was ever reading these words, it meant she had chosen truth over a throne. Audrey stood frozen, unable to speak for a long moment. In the days following the collapse of the conspiracy, Wexford Dominion entered a period of turbulence in the press. Yet the company did not fall apart the way Leland had predicted. Major shareholders rallied behind Audrey, precisely because she had chosen to expose the corruption herself before the corrupted deal could be finalized. She found Rowan back on the technical floor, quietly packing his tools, as though the events of that day had nothing to do with him at all. She told him he could ask for anything he wanted: money, shares, a position on the board, real power within the company he had helped save. Rowan declined every offer of executive authority. He asked only for 3 things in return: that Mallory's name and reputation be formally restored, that her death finally receive a proper investigation, and that the lowest-paid employees who had been pressured into silence over the years finally receive real protection. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he wanted no public statement made in his own name, no interviews, no photograph placed beside a headline calling him a hero, since he had never done any of this to be seen. Audrey studied him for a long moment, struck by how thoroughly his requests centered on people other than himself, a rarity she had encountered so few times in boardrooms full of people who measured every favor by what it might earn them in return. She agreed to all 3 conditions without negotiation, a decision that would have been unthinkable for her only days earlier, when every request that crossed her desk was weighed first against what it cost her personally. The investigation into Mallory's death was reopened within the week. Led by an independent agency, Audrey insisted on funding separately from the company's own legal department, ensuring no lingering influence from anyone still loyal to the old regime could interfere with its findings. Audrey offered him an apology unlike any she had ever given before, not the polished, rehearsed kind executives deliver to cameras, but the kind spoken by someone who finally understood she had spent years as part of a system built to look past people like him. Her voice caught slightly as she spoke, an unfamiliar vulnerability for a woman who had trained herself for years to sound certain regardless of what she felt underneath. She admitted that she had built her entire sense of self around being the smartest person in every room she entered, and that assumption had blinded her to threats standing in plain sight simply because they wore the wrong uniform or held the wrong title. Rowan did not offer easy forgiveness, nor did he demand further penance, understanding that some realizations mattered more when a person was left to sit with them rather than have them smoothed over immediately. He simply nodded, acknowledging what she had said without pretending it erased anything that had already happened. It was, in its own quiet way, more honest than any conversation either of them had shared with anyone else in that building for a very long time. She told him plainly that she had once looked at him as though he did not belong in that building at all. Rowan answered that she had not looked at him that way on her own. She had simply been taught to look at everyone without the Wexford name in exactly that manner. The words struck harder than anything spoken in the boardroom that morning, and Audrey understood she could not rebuild her company by returning to the person she used to be. She appointed an independent interim oversight board, established a formal office to protect internal whistleblowers, and renamed the entire recovery infrastructure the Mallory Pierce Archive in permanent recognition of the woman who had tried to warn everyone years before anyone would listen. She personally attended the small ceremony marking the renaming, standing beside a modest plaque rather than a grand unveiling, aware that anything more elaborate would have betrayed the quiet dignity Mallory herself seemed to have valued. Employees who had never known the woman behind the name lingered afterward regardless, reading the short inscription twice, as though absorbing a lesson the company had taken far too long to teach them. Rowan returned quietly to his small apartment in Queens, where the only visible trace of his daughter remained a school bag left beside the door and a crayon drawing taped to the wall that simply read, "Dad fixes broken things." It was enough to remind the audience of who he was, without pulling his family any further into danger. Several months later, Wexford Dominion had steadied itself into something calmer and more honest than it had ever been before. Audrey remained at the head of the company, but she was no longer the same woman who once believed that authority alone made her correct. She had learned slowly and deliberately to listen to the people working on the lower floors, the maintenance staff, the assistants, the drivers, the technicians, people who had always noticed everything happening around them, yet had rarely, if ever, been asked a single question. She began holding informal meetings on the technical floor itself, rather than summoning employees up to her office. Choosing to sit at a folding table beside the same servers Rowan had once maintained, rather than behind polished walnut. Word of the practice spread slowly through the company, and what began as a handful of hesitant conversations grew into a genuine channel between the people running daily operations and the woman making decisions above them. Several long-buried concerns finally surfaced through those conversations, minor compared to what Rowan had uncovered, yet each one a reminder of how much had gone unheard for far too long simply because nobody with authority had ever bothered to sit down and ask. Rowan never became a flashy public figure chasing attention or wealth. He accepted formal recognition for the recovery system he had built, a fair financial settlement for everything he had endured, and, most importantly, the complete removal of Mallory's name from every past record, blaming her for technical failures that had never been her fault to begin with. The final scene of this long ordeal returned to the same boardroom on the 88th floor where everything had first unraveled. Audrey now stood there preparing to sign an entirely different kind of document, one establishing a permanent fund to protect employees who dared to report wrongdoing inside the company. This time there was no fabricated audience, no false allies whispering behind polished smiles, no eyes filled with quiet contempt. Rowan returned once more and placed the original folded note back into her hands. Audrey opened it and discovered a line on the back she had never noticed before, one she had somehow overlooked entirely during the chaos of that first morning. It read that if she ever did the right thing, she should not thank him for it, but instead thank the woman who died, wanting her to become someone better than the relatives who raised her. Audrey's throat tightened, and for a moment she could not speak at all. Rowan turned and walked toward the elevator without waiting for a response, but before the doors closed behind him, he left one final slip of paper resting on the table. Audrey unfolded it slowly and found only a single sentence written across the page. It told her that next time she should learn to hear the warning bells herself, long before someone like him ever had to write them down for her. She thought, standing there, of the version of herself who had walked into that same room believing a folded piece of paper deserved nothing more than the nearest waste bin. That version of her had mistaken authority for wisdom and silence from those beneath her for irrelevance rather than restraint. It had taken a single quiet man with nothing to gain and everything already lost to show her the difference, and she understood now that the debt she owed him could never truly be repaid, only honored through the choices she made from that day forward. Somewhere below her, the city continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to the quiet revolution that had just taken place inside one glass tower among thousands. The story closes with Audrey standing alone in that vast boardroom, looking out across the endless skyline of the city below her. For the first time in her entire life, she did not see the tower beneath her feet as a throne built for her family's glory. She saw it, finally and completely, as a responsibility she now intended to carry the right way.
Oh shit. Damn. I don't even have a video. Wish I did. Damn. Oh my gosh. I need to equip the transformation too. Here we go. I think it's gotta be something up here, right? Oh yeah. I haven't been this way. Is this like the next boss fight? Holy shit. Nice. We're working it. Keep going. We're on our way.